Well, my great pleasure to participate in this event, and I was told that this talk is related to my book, recently published in Buenos Aires, Fragmenting the Future, essays on technodiversity. So today I'm going to stick to the question of technodiversity, where this is talk that I have given several times already, but I risk repeating what I have said. I hope that you don't mind if you have listened that before. Now, what does it mean by technodiversity? And I hope that in this lecture that I will be able to explain, to you what is technodiversity. But more precisely, I want to explain to you why it's necessary to talk about technodiversity. What is the necessity of articulating technodiversity? We have been talking about biodiversity, we have been talking about other forms of diversity, but probably not technodiversity. And what I'm going to show to you, but I also want to claim here, is that for us to imagine, to think about biodiversity, it is first of all and necessarily to think about technodiversity. Where are we today? What is our status today concerning technological development? I want to show you this image where you can see this graph of technological singularity, which is basically a history of artificial intelligence or a history of computational machines, where you can see that it is moving exponentially towards a point called technological singularity. What does it mean? Technological singularity means, first of all, briefly, that the computer or the machine is able to reflect on itself. That means it has consciousness. And when the machine has this kind of consciousness and intelligence, we can imagine that all different machines forming together, and it is able to produce an amount of intelligence which far beyond the intelligence of human being. It is also called intelligence explosion. The intelligence explosion has a lot to do with the discourse of the end of enlightenment, the surveillance society, the replacement of the state by a supercomputer, mass unemployment, so on and so forth. But it means that we are moving towards a historical endpoint. If either there is anything new to be opened is another question. But apparently we are moving towards one endpoint. And with the current geopolitics, we know that China, Russia, the USA, and many other countries in this world are competing towards the technological singularity, to see who is going to arrive at technological singularity faster. And more cynically, to say cynically, we can say that they are competing to see who is going to finish first. This technological progress is reflected in a larger or much more longer historical context, which we call the Anthropocene. Now I'm showing you another picture that of the graph of the Anthropocene. We can see that from this picture the Anthropocene started since the Industrial Revolution, 1750s. But of course, some historians may want to trace it even earlier. For example, the beginning of agriculture, or some other people, the beginning of colonization, of European colonization in America, for example. But here, let's stick to this picture. Let's stick to the point that Industrial Revolution was the beginning, if not the beginning, it's the accelerator of the Anthropocene, And as some of you may know, that the Anthropocene means a new geological era in which the activity of human beings are affecting the geochemical reactions of the Earth. What is associated with the Anthropocene is global warming, ecological crisis, mass extinction. The sixth extinction that may arrive, or it may not arrive, but there is such a crisis. That it suggests, and I think this is already announced, very evident in the pandemic that we're experiencing, the coronavirus pandemic, that the mode of industrialization and the forms of life that we are having are not sustainable. That means we need to take changes. We need to make changes. And this is the reason for which we have to talk about tecnodiversity. I want to show you another picture where I try to describe that the history of technological singularity and the history of the Anthropocene belong to the same process, which we call modernization. What does it mean by modernization? I make a distinction between modernity, modernism, and modernization. Modernism, a genre in literature, in the arts. Modernity, methodological and epistemological rupture, which took place in the 16th and 17th century. Modernization is a universalization process which promotes and universalize a particular epistemology, knowledge, practice worldwide. And it is through technology that we see the different historical time, as you can see on this slide, and that these curves indicates different historical time, and how this different historical time synchronize. How this technological historical time synchronize and converge towards one endpoint, which we have called before technological singularity, and if you prefer, you can also call it apocalypse or homo deus, the becoming God of man. So technology, which has been conceived to be universal, is also the medium through which different historical time are converged, and now is moving towards one endpoint. As a response to the Anthropocene, there has been many discussions, and I would like to highlight the efforts of the anthropologists. And here I refer to a specific to a symposium took place in 2015 in Paris, organized by anthropologists such as Philippe Descola. And for the anthropologists, they wanted to reflect on the question of modernity by showing that the epistemology, or we can say ontology, that means what is nature? What is nature? The concept of nature that we have inherited now is very much from European modernity, and that Philippe Descola called it naturalism. Naturalism means the opposition between nature and culture. Descola also showed that there are different concepts of nature. For example, animism, totemism, and analogism. There are different other kind of ontologies according to Philippe Descola. But on top of this, Eduardo Varela's de Castro, I think most of you have read his work, also proposed what he calls perspectivism from the Amerindian practice. But most significantly, Eduardo Varela's de Castro proposed what he called multinaturalism. And I think this is a rather radical gesture. So what he says is that instead of thinking about multiculturalism, which means one nature, and on top of that there are multiple cultures, and that's what we do today in many countries, actually we should think of multinaturalism. That means that we all live in the same culture, but they're different natures. Now, it doesn't mean that the archaic or the non-modern ontologies are better than modern ontologies, but rather that there are different ways of thinking and behaving. There are different relations between human and non-humans. And this complexity of relations and ways of knowing seems to have reduced and eliminated in the process of modernization. And it seems very urgent today to ask, what are the implications of this knowledge? Should we restrict it to, for example, preserving them as ancient craft or skills? Or should we find a different theoretical framework to accommodate them, and then also to give them new life? Concerning the work of the anthropologists, I try to show in my own works, that maybe it is not sufficient to just focus on the question of nature. Because nature as a concept does not exist alone. Nature exists also in related to culture, to technology. And returning to the question of nature seems not sufficient to deal with the question of modernization today, because how are we going to resist the process of modernization without falling back to an opposition between tradition and modern, and risk falling victim to a certain proto-fascism? That is the reason for which I propose to think or to reopen, instead of reopening the question of nature, I propose to reopen the concept of techniques or technology. To think a multiplicity of what I call cosmotechnics, or we stated at the very beginning, tecnodiversity. And I wanted to show in this picture that only with different imagination of technology and different practice are we able to escape the convergence towards the endpoint, towards the apocalypse. To reopen the question of technology and therefore the question of history. How is it possible when today we are told that technology is universal, that there is a universal rationality in technology which is objective and universal? So we can only follow this trajectory without being able to deviate from it. This is a historical problem that we have. And it is precisely what I want to show, that this discourse of the universality of technology in philosophy of technology, in anthropology, in history of technology, seems to have missed the point. That instead of claiming, of imagining a single history, a single universal history of technology, we must reconstruct different histories of technology and to reflect on the possibility of these histories. And only by doing so are we able to reopen the question of technology and also the imagination of technologies. As you can see in this image, that the historical time deviate from the conversions and it diverge again. I would like to raise here what I call the antinomy of the universality of technology, which I have explored in 2016 in my book, The Question Concerning Technology, an Essay in Cosmotechnics, where I proposed what I called antinomy of the universality of technology. And for some of you who have studied Immanuel Kant, you may know that an antinomy consists of two parts, thesis and antithesis. When you look at the thesis alone, it is correct. And it goes the same for the antithesis. But when you put them together, contradiction, tension, incompatibility. And Kant has resolved these antinomies. Now, I think that concerning the question of technology, we also have a similar antinomy, which we can state as the following. Thesis: technology is an anthropological universal understood as the externalization of memory and liberation of bodily organs, as some anthropologists and philosophers of technology have formulated. So technology is the externalization of memory and liberation of bodily organs, which you can find almost in all different civilizations. Therefore, it is universal. The antithesis: technology is not anthropologically universal, it is enabled and constrained by particular cosmologies which go beyond functionalities and utilities. So instead of saying that, well, writing is an externalization of memory, or the use of certain tools is a liberation of bodily organs, in writing itself, we find different relations. For example, between human beings and animals, human beings and non-human beings. A complexity of relations. So, for example, if you look into Chinese writing, it is a pictorial writing, but not phonetic writing. And this pictorial writing could be seen as an indication of relation between, for example, different beings. Also, if you look into Chinese medicine, it's basically based completely on Chinese cosmology. The language, vocabularies, understanding some as well. But Chinese medicine is not compatible with Western medicine. They're from different epistemologies. They have different epistemologies and ontologies. So, for example, if you ask a Chinese medical doctor to show me what is qi, which means energy, how can he show that? You cannot show it. You cannot prove there is energy, this kind of energy. So from a materialist point of view, this is not scientific, this is wrong. But we know that it exists since 1,000 years and it is still effective today. So this antinomy wanted to show that there is certain universal dimension in technology, but there is also a particular dimension in technology, and maybe we should focus on the antithesis of the antinomy. This question seems to have been repressed in the past decade. Even in this book, I try to respond to the famous Neham's question, Joseph Neham's raised. Why didn't modern science and technology develop in China and in India, but only in Europe? And my reading is that what you were trying to emphasize is that one cannot compare Chinese for example, medicine directly with Western medicine, because actually these are two different things, even though they are called medicine, even though they could be categorized as medical technology. And it's not that, it doesn't mean that one is inferior than the other. Therefore, there is a technodiversity, and this technodiversity must be, bring to the fore today, in order to imagine what are the futures of technology, and is it possible at all to imagine a technodiversity, to re-articulate the technodiversity, and also its futures, through reappropriating modern technologies by giving it new directions and new frameworks. So it's not about negating technology, but giving it new framework. Or in the sense of, paraphrasing Heidegger, we can say, can we give a new frame to the enframing, or reframing the enframing, the Gestalt. This is one aspect of technodiversity, and that we can approach from a cultural, historical background and resources. In order to imagine the diversity of culture. And for me, I was thinking that this is not only a justification of culture, but rather it implies an imperative. We must imagine technodiversity instead of being determined by, for example, Silicon Valley or the disruptive technology that we have today. However, the question of culture is one perspective to look into the question of diversity. I would also like to highlight another different approach. This different approach is not necessarily from a cultural historical point of view, but rather from an ontological and epistemological point of view. Now, I think the best way to talk about this is by giving you an example. For people who have no interest to get into philosophy of culture, how could we imagine a technodiversity? I want to give you an example on social network, which is a project that I have done quite some years ago, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. A project that I have done with Harry Halpin, a computer scientist, and Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, my former professor, who just died in August, 2 months ago. In this project, we propose to develop an alternative to Facebook, kind of social network. How do we do it? An alternative? I know that in Spain, a few years ago in Spain, because of the social movement, there was an alternative called Lorea, a social network. There was also Crabgrass and many other social networks. But when I started this network, they didn't seem to me much different from Facebook. The difference is that they don't belong to Facebook. They don't belong to any property owner. They're owned by a collective, for example. But this doesn't justify to be called alternative. It is alternative only because from the point of view of properties, but not in terms of its functionality, not in terms of its epistemological and ontological assumptions. Today, if you look into social networks such as WeChat in China, Facebook, or the one in Russia, Vidovka, I think, called. Actually, they are the same. They have different interfaces, but they belong to the same. They are all based on the same epistemological and ontological assumptions. What are these assumptions? In this research, I try to show that the origin of social networks actually could be traced to the psychologist and sociologist Jacob Levi-Moreno, who was once a student of Sigmund Freud in Vienna before he moved to the USA and developed what he called sociometry, who also has quite some influence on Kurt Lewin, who is also very famous for his group sociology, or what is called group dynamics. Now, the work of Jacob Moreno, his theory is based on the following assumptions. Firstly, every individual is a social atom. The society is an aggregation of social atoms. So each individual is a social atom. The society is an aggregation of social atoms. And social relation means a line between two dots, a line between 2 points. We can know social relations by drawing a line between 2 points, between two atoms. And Jacob Moreno, when he was the president of a girls' school in Houston, in the USA, there was a problem with the school. Is that these young girls, they stay in the school because of some minor criminals. However, the runaway rates of the girls in this school is very, very high, much higher than the average. And what Moreno has done is that he asked these girls a very simple question: who would you like to sit next to? Who would you like to talk to? And then he plotted a graph. He plotted a graph. On this graph, it shows that the allocation of these girls in different dormitories were wrong. They put people, they shouldn't make this combination. So he rearranged the pairing of the dormitory and reduced radically the runaway rate. So Moreno used his sociometry to do many projects, very interesting projects. But what I wanted to approach here is that there are certain kind of assumptions being made in this social network. And I repeat, each individual is a social atom. The society, the collective, start with the social atoms and then aggregate. And the social relation could be understood, could be identified by drawing one line between two dots. Now, from a philosophical, anthropological, and philosophical point of view, these assumptions are problematic. Because, first of all, from an anthropological point of view, there is no point, or it is not valid to argue that the society starts with social atoms, with individuals, where actually the society started with collectives. It's only in modern society that it is that we believe that it started with individuals. But in fact, it started with collectives. So a society is not an aggregate of social atoms. So ontological assumption is already problematic. Social relation is not something to be marked up by drawing a line between two dots. The social relations is much more dense and complex than just indicating I know you or I know you. The French philosopher Cahiers Simondon, in his book Individuation in the light of the notions of formal information, are very important to work on individuation, where he points out that it is not possible, if it is not wrong, to separate the individual from the collective in order to think about individuation. So you see that there is a kind of implicit critique of Simondon on the work of Moreno, and indeed Moreno's name was mentioned by Simondon several times in the work. So we may want to put forward another assumption. Instead of starting with the social atom, which are the individuals, can we start with collectives? And this means that in the social network, the individual is no longer the basic unit of the network, but rather collectives. The idea was to form a social network. I cannot go into details here, but the idea is to create a new social network based on collectives and develop tools that allows collaboration, which is not allowed on Facebook. On Facebook, they also have groups, but these groups have nothing to do with collective. On the group, you are still an individual. Because a collective or a group is defined by a project, which also means projection. A group is defined by a project. And with this new idea, or this new assumption, we are able to develop and unfold an alternate social network, which has different epistemological and ontological assumptions. So here, what I've been saying are two approaches. One approach, from a cultural historical perspective, to understand the imperative, and again I want to emphasize the term imperative, to think about tecnodiversity. And this could be analyzed and developed through the reconstruction of the history of cosmotechnics. The second approach, which is less from a cultural historical point of view, but still very historical because history is very important, by questioning the ontological and epistemological assumptions of technologies in order to ask what could be the alternatives, what could be the other forms of technologies we can imagine. So the question is less about properties. The question is less about decentralization or centralization, even though it's still a very important question. I'm not saying it's not important, but I am saying that the question of alternative cannot be reduced to the question of centralization, decentralization, property, perpetual, or it's a free software. No. But rather, the key difference is alternative forms, alternative assumptions in epistemology and ontology. And for me, I believe that this is the blind spot of accelerationism, which doesn't want to open the question of alternative, but only by accelerating towards the endpoint, to gamble that after this endpoint there is a new beginning, which means eschatology. I hope that it is now clear for you why we have to talk about technodiversity and how we can talk about technodiversity. Now, maybe there are other ways to think through this, And still, I want to emphasize that if today we want to think about biodiversity, the question of tecnodiversity is necessary and primary for us. So, I will end here from a presentation, and I hope that we can continue approaching, discussing and approaching the question of tecnodiversity. But this will have to be a collective project. Because I'm also equally interested in how, for example, Latin American cosmotechnics could be articulated and could be useful or could contribute for the imagination of tecnodiversity today and for the future. Thank you very much for your attention.